Garrison, and I want to welcome you to day 78.
Jim, we have to do a restart on it. Hold on a second. Card, it's got to do it again.
Oops. Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison, and I want to welcome you to day 78 of Humanity Rising. Every day since the 22nd of May, Ubiquity University and upwards of 350 partnering organizations from all over the world have created Humanity Rising as a 2-hour open space between 5 and 7 o'clock p.m. Central European Time, so that people everywhere can come together and share their experiences of how we're navigating through this extraordinary pandemic that is shaping the world in totally unexpected ways. We're all under some form of lockdown. Our economies are essentially at standstills. Many of us are without jobs. All of us are engaging in some form of social distancing, wearing masks, and engaging in a lot of reflection about what all this means, how we're going to survive to the other side, and what the world's going to look like post-pandemic. Our mission is to bring people together so that we can form a coalition to ensure that the post-pandemic world is more sustainable, more resilient, more healthy, more abundant, and more in alignment with natural systems. This may be the greatest challenge of our lives. Scientists are telling us that over the next few years, certainly over the decade of the 2020s, we're either going to stop climate change and all the other global crises, or the world as we know it is going to be irremediably altered for the worst. And I think that the gravity of the crisis deepens with each passing day. Back in February and March, when the pandemic started, there was a lot of speculation that it'd be over by spring. But here we are in the middle of August, and the pandemic is not only still with us, the pandemic is getting worse in many areas of the world. Just today, it was reported Africa now has reported over 1 million cases. And the United States continues to set daily records for COVID cases, similarly with Brazil, Russia, India, China, Australia. Many people are starving in countries that were impoverished before the pandemic and now are destitute because of the pandemic. So as we think through how we understand and how we navigate through and how we shape the future to come, it's going to require leadership probably like the human race has never had to develop ever before. Just yesterday, we commemorated the 75th anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima. 2 days from now, on the 9th of August, we'll be commemorating the 75th anniversary of the bombing of Nagasaki. And in the panel yesterday, the one consistent plea was for more conscious leadership, not only amongst our leaders, but amongst the public. Because the leaders only seem to lead reacting to public pressure. And with everything that's been going on, the nuclear issue and the dangers, the growing dangers of the nuclear issue are becoming more and more acute. In fact, the director of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists was on yesterday, and she said that the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists clock, which has given us how close we are to Armageddon for the last 35, 40 years since its inception, is now at 1.5 minutes to midnight. So the call ended with a plea for leadership. So that's the subject that we're going to consider today. How do we understand what conscious leadership is? How do we nurture it in ourselves? How do we bring conscious leadership into the place, into the marketplace, into the councils of governance at this critical moment in our collective history? I'm delighted that we're going to be convened by John Renesch, who's the convener of the Conscious Leadership Guild, and has been working for many years to bring leaders together to explore and develop the meaning of conscious leadership. So thank you, John. I'll turn the platform now over to you and your colleagues.
I've communicated with John.
There we go. Okay. Thanks, Jim, for that introduction. I'm glad you mentioned that conscious leadership has to come not only from the designated leaders in the world, but also from individuals that see the need for stepping up. In fact, in my view, that's where most of the conscious leadership is showing up, is in ordinary people taking extraordinary steps towards resolving issues that are in position of people of authority aren't taking responsibility for. The conscious leadership movement, so to speak, has been going on for, in my view, for 30, 40 years, something like that. It wasn't always called conscious leadership, but it's being called conscious leadership now. At some point, a year and a half ago, almost 2 years ago, a group of us that I consider all part, we're not related, but we're all part of the movement, got together and formed a Congress called the Conscious Leadership Congress, a one-time event, to pull people together that were doing work in the conscious leadership field. This included academics, consultants, executives leading organizations. And out of that Congress grew the need, desire, vision for a guild, a professional association for people whose work centered around conscious leadership, whether they use that phrase or not. And we started the Conscious Leadership Guild a year and a half ago. 18 of us were the founders, you might say. But the beginnings of it were largely around who's actively involved in doing this. And we wanted a mix of academics, consultants, and executives, because my experience in the past has been if you get too heavy in any one area, you tend to, a lot of the people in the other areas might get kind of turned off. So we're keeping it fairly close to an even match of those three types. It's by invitation only. So we're looking to screen people to the degree that there's a lot of people that we've noticed wanting to get on the conscious leadership bandwagon. I call them wannabes, but they aren't there yet. But we've managed to attract over 100 people so far that are incredible souls to work with. We have a number of activities going on. We're on Zoom a lot, as somebody alluded to earlier. So with that, when I was asked to put a panel together for the Humanity Rising project, I thought, well, I'll get one of each. I'll get an academic, I'll get an executive, and I'll get a consultant. So the best known of those three members that I picked were probably is Joseph Jaworski. He's been a longtime consultant. I first met him in '91 when I was running the World Business Academy. He was doing scenario planning with over in England with Shell. And it's been a delight to have him back in my life on a regular basis. And then on the academic side, we have Corrie Voss, who's at Bowling Green University. She's going to be speaking second after Joseph. And then finally, we have David Marshall, who's the CEO of Berrett-Koehler. I first met David when he joined Berrett-Koehler as, if I recall correctly, the online guru to help Berrett-Koehler get into the digital world. So each of them will speak for a few minutes and share their point of view about conscious leadership. And then we'll come back and have a little bit of a roundtable discussion about what was said. And then we'll turn it back over to Jim for closing. So you guys all ready for that? Joseph, I can't see you.
Yeah.
But are you ready to be? Let me see if I can.
I can see Joseph.
Oh, there we go. There we go. Now he shows up. Okay, thank you. So Joseph, with that, I'm going to introduce you. Joseph is a trained lawyer. Don't hold that against him, though. He also started the American Leadership Forum years ago, which has got chapters all over the world. He kind of disappeared from my radar for a while, and then he showed up when we had our World Business Academy retreat in Stockholm, I believe it was. And he soon thereafter affiliated with Peter Senge and the group in Boston, and came out with a book called Synchronicity, which is probably his best-selling book. He's since written a book on Source, and I hope to write another book with him at some point in time on elaborating on Source. I think that was a great book. So with that, Joseph, you're on.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, John. That's a great lead-in for me. First, let me just say, Jim, it's so good to be with you on this program. It's been a long time since we were together, and I am deeply touched by the introduction you just gave. And John, you mentioned Source, so I want to address for a few moments what I think is the core competency that will enable the kind of response that Jim just mentioned. And that core competency is the capacity to connect to Source. I'm going to explain briefly what I mean by that. I'm going to also address where does this come from? And the third thing is I want to just briefly address how we connect to Source. What are the ways we gain access to it. So first, let me just give open by giving an illustration of what connecting to Source looks and feels like. And I'll just do that by telling a story. When I was 18 and just a freshman in college at Baylor University, an F5 tornado packing winds of 325 miles an hour tore right through the middle of downtown Waco, which is about 2 blocks from my dorm. And in the wake of that, just after it cleared, I made my way over to the epicenter of it, and it's like a nuclear device had gone on. It was just utter destruction everywhere. And we formed a team of 6 people and began pulling people out. And the team and I worked together for 18 hours straight, because this was in an area where you couldn't move heavy equipment and everything. And we were able to save a lot of people. And I just want to describe the qualities of the community that we created there, because that's a perfect description of what it's like to collectively connect a source. The first thing is, each one of us, I'll speak for myself, I just became, in the midst of this crisis, just hyper aware. It was as if I had some sort of a laser awareness, and everything I did was not from a cognitive place. It was spontaneous, and I would do things in saving people that was in a way that metaphorically, I would look over my shoulder and say, did I do that? Is that me doing that? So it's a sense of not even me doing it, but being an instrument to be used with a force that is beyond your own capability. And the other thing, between the 6 of us, there was just this high coherence. It was as if we were operating as one intelligence. You would say a single intelligence, and we would move almost like a flock of birds, without even having to speak to one another. One of the other hallmarks, which was striking to me, was that my premonitions were consistently correct. I had exceptional foresight. I could sense where to go next. And all I can say is that for me individually and for the whole team, the effect of it was shockingly effective. That's all I can say. And we operated that way for those 18 hours. Now, this is not an unknown phenomenon in the midst of crisis or on the battlefield. But it is difficult to access, without such a crisis. And I swore up and down when that was over with and I had a few days to reflect on it. I said to myself, someday I will find a way to do that, to form a team and create teamwork like this without killing hundreds and injuring thousands. And so, in line with what John was saying earlier, I ended up ultimately leaving the practice of law to pursue this calling and this dream. And what I want to share with you is what I've learned over these 20 or 25 years. So first, the question is, where does this come from, this capacity? And the scientists and the medical doctors have something like 12 or more names for it. One of the names it's often used is that this comes from the implicate order. Others say it comes from the Akashic field. Others say it comes from the 0 point field. And there's many other names. In talking with the most advanced scientists that have studied this phenomenon, several of them said to me, there's so many names and it's so confusing, I'm just going to call it source or the source. And so I began doing that. And and John mentioned that I wrote a book about this. I did that so I could learn more, actually. And here's where it comes from. It comes from this field called source, or these other names. It's a field of active information. And when we have gained the capacity to access this, it comes into the gut first, and then goes to the heart, and up to 7 seconds later, it goes to the brain, and you can cognize and use the brain that way. So all the science shows that there are these millions of neurons in the gut and in the heart. Sometimes they call it the little brain in the gut, little brain in the heart. So it enters there and ultimately ends up in the brain. But the hallmark of this sort of access to information is that it arrives whole. It doesn't arrive incrementally. It's like bang, it shows up there, and you begin using it. And I will tell you that it is the purest form of information you can gain. Now, the question is, I mean, there's so much to say, and we can have conversation or question and answer about it. But the first question one may ask, well, how do I gain access to this reliably? What is the way to reliably be able to connect to source when I really need it? And we've studied this extensively and have come up with a process that helps. Not only helps, it actually enables it. And this process goes by various names. We call it at our firm, we call it the U process. Sometimes the U theory, sometimes it's known as theory U, but it's all the same process. We discovered this when a major client had a merger of 3 downstream energy companies, and they wanted to determine the source of the entrepreneurial impulse. And they, there you go, the source of the entrepreneurial impulse. And we worked for 9 months, came up with that theory U, or the U process. And here's what it looks like. If you imagine a U, on the left-hand side of the U, you would put observe, observe, observe 3 times. And we write that 3 times because it is critical to get a handle on what current reality looks like. If you miss understanding really what the current reality is and what you're after, then you might as well hang it up. It's not going to work. So on the left side of the U at the beginning is observe, observe, observe. And then toward the bottom of the U is letting go. You've got to let go of your preconceived notions of what the answer to this critical issue is that you're focusing on, that you're trying to discover the answer to. So you have to let go of this, of your expectations of what's going to show up, and you got to let go of all of your hopes about exactly what it's going to look like, because that's inconsistent with source. When you're tapping into source, you're tapping into source to provide the answer as it desires, not as you desire. So that's the letting go piece. And then you go to the bottom of the U, which is where you go to that deeper place of knowing. Sometimes we have written about it in terms of calling it presencing, like it's being present and sensing. It's putting those two words together. So it's either presencing or connecting to source. And that's what happens at the bottom of the U. And that's when this information shows up, bang, like that. And then on the right-hand side, you begin crystallizing that information that you gained, and on the right-hand side, many times we write, act swiftly in flow. So the fact is that if you don't act on this information and act in a timely way, it's not going to work. The whole process is when the information shows up and you act on it, that's the ticket for the next piece of information. It's also like a dialogue with the universe. It's where you act on it and then you seek the next piece of information, and it's a constant dialogue with the universe, as many people have said. So that's the process whereby you can reliably access it. Now, the thing I want to emphasize is that there's an element that is critical to this, and that is the people or the person accessing source has to focus on their interior condition. The principle is the success of the intervention is strictly dependent upon the interior condition of the intervener. It's dependent upon your interior condition. So we have to pay, strict attention to that. And the way to do that is through practices. Many of the people watching this would be people who have been doing these sort of things. I mean, the first practice, which I think is the most powerful, is simply being in nature and being in nature consistently. Many times when individuals or collectives that we work with, and this works with one or two people, and it works with something like 20 or 30 or 40. We've done it with up to 40 people together to access this using that U process. So being out in nature, and we'll put people on solo, for example, for 3 nights and 4 days, and then bring them back together as a collective, and then begin dialogue in David Bohm's fashion of dialogue to access this. So being out in nature is a principal element of this. The second is a practice. The way to cultivate this capacity is meditation, and to do this on a regular basis and use this as a discipline. Make this as your supreme concern, these practices. And the third one would be an energy practice like Tai Chi or Qigong, and doing it in the morning regularly in nature. And these practices help you reliably, gain access to source. And there's a lot more I can say about this, but that's the big picture. And the point is that if one operates this way and cultivates the capacity to operate this way, their life becomes synchronous and full of synchronicities, full of discovery, full of where doors open magically when you hold the intention and you hold the commitment to resolve this particular issue or this social issue like the crisis we're facing. Commitment is everything. And so this is the way an individual's life can unfold. And this is the way that a group like I described, the 6 or up to 20 or 40 people operating together, their practice of discovery can unfold. So, John, I'm going to stop there. We can have dialogue later, but I'm going to turn it back over to you.
John, there's one great question for Joe in the chat that I'd like to share. It's from Malini Rajendran. His question is around when we feel those feelings in the gut, that it's actually us not absorbing what is going on. And that information is then not aligned with our higher purpose or higher self, and that our ego is in the way. So his question was, why gut, heart, brain versus heart, and then in 2 directions, I believe. Can you answer to that?
Okay. Yeah. So look, the scientists have discovered when this information arrives and how it arrives, and I like the way that you're emphasizing the heart, but the science shows that this purest form of information arrives first in the gut and then goes to the heart. Now, the heart, in most traditions for millennia, has been seen as the transmitter station for spirit, and the heart processes this and then sends it straight up to the brain. It takes sometimes up to 7 seconds for you to actually act on it. And so I guess if I've never been asked that particular question, but if I was going to sort of try to process it, I would say that the heart, if you're really operating from the heart, you're not going to be operating from ego, and it's going to filter this information, and it's going to be pure.
Thanks, Joseph. Thanks so much.
You're welcome.
Corrie, I'm going to put you up next. Corrie Voss is the only one of the 3 panelists here that I didn't know before we formed the guild. We've never met in person, face to face, which is amazing. It seems like I know you so well. We've collaborated on a couple of articles for the guild, the most recent one being about the benefit of engagement for members and getting value out of being a member of the guild. And as I mentioned earlier, she's on the faculty at Bowling Green. She's a researcher. I probably am leaving out a lot of things I could be saying, but I'd like you to say them at the beginning of your talk so you can further credentialize yourself amongst our watchers, our viewers, Corrie.
Sure. Great. Thanks, John. And thank you everyone for joining and your beautiful messages in the chat. There's been a lot of really great questions in there, so thank you for that. Like John said, my name is Corrie Voss. I am what I would consider to be a scholar practitioner. So while I am definitely in the academic world doing research, particularly on conscious leaders, I like to say that I study these leaders in the wild. I want to see them in their element, in their organizations, dealing directly with their people so that we can learn more about what these practices look like. And at the same time, I also like to work with executives directly and their organizations to try and bring these practices into our organizations, making them much more healthier places to be. I mean, when you think about it, we spend a third of our waking lives in and interacting with these organizations. And right now, so many of them they're sick, they're toxic, and they're difficult for human beings to successfully exist within those organizations. And so that is the other part of what I do. I am at Bowling Green State University in Bowling Green, Ohio, involved with the Master of Organization Development program in the College of Business. And so our focus is really business. So based on some of the things that Joe was just saying, I wanted to share a little bit about why I got interested in conscious leadership. You know, I believe that business and business leaders may be some of our most powerful institutions in the world today. That power can be used for negative reasons, but it can also be used for good reasons. One of the reasons that I connected with John is that, John, you can correct me on the year here, but sometime in the 1980s, I believe you said that business was the locomotive that pulled society and what happens here. And so our business leaders really do have the opportunity to use their power as a force for good. Chris Laszlo, who's out of Case Western Reserve University, is asking businesses to shift, though, from that force for good, right? We want to see system-wide transformation and a disruption in that management thinking so that business is not just a force for good, but it becomes an agent of world benefit. How can we be agents of world benefit, right? So this is what I'm working with the business leaders on in the area and what my research is around. Joe, I have to tell you, I love hearing your story. I love that story every time you tell it, and that how our guts really are the quickest way to find out what is going on. When we look at some of that scientific research around neuroscience, it's really important that we understand that our brain sees even when we don't. Almost 95% of what we do is controlled by our unconscious brain. Okay. These are patterns, ritualized behaviors that we are on autopilot for most of our day and do not even realize it. The information shows that through our five senses, all of our ways that we take information in, that about 11 million pieces of data come into our five senses every second. 11 million pieces of data every second. Our conscious brain can only process 40 of those pieces. So you can see where these patterns of behavior and this unconscious operating, it's really important to us moving through the world. We would become completely overwhelmed with that amount of information if it wasn't for that background processing that our brains are working on. So why conscious leadership, right? So conscious leadership is really about being awake and aware in the present moment. When we think about world-class leadership, what we want to see from our leaders, back in 1995, there was a study by Harung on world-class leadership, and also some work in the mid-2000s on spiritual consciousness, and by Reeves. And when we think about those qualities in those leaders, what they found were the things that we want to see, right? From the people who are leading us: integrity, respect, fair treatment, empathy, compassion, listening. That world-class leaders with these high levels of consciousness have these qualities, right? So when it comes to researching conscious leadership in the field, it's still emerging and very nascent. The data and definitions have not quite been pinned down. Quantitatively, I mean, how do you measure consciousness? We have researchers who are attempting, and at the same time, it feels as though if we try to measure something as ineffable as consciousness, that it loses some of its quality when we do. So most of my work is around qualitative research, looking at how these leaders implement these practices in their daily business lives, and how this changes the interior of them. It really starts on the inside. The business leader goes first, and then is a role model for these practices throughout the organization. So the development of consciousness really is another type of leadership development that we don't give enough attention to. We do a lot this way, horizontal development. We develop skills, right? Skills that make us good leaders. You know, do I get my stuff done on time, right? Do I get my reports done? What are the things that I need to do for this job? But there's also a vertical access called vertical learning. And Nick Petrie out of the Center for Creative Leadership had a great study in 2011 outlining these dimensions of vertical development, that when we focus on the interior and character development of the leader, that it becomes a skill that cannot be obsolete. We are forever changed when we develop along these lines of ego maturity, moral maturity, emotional intelligence. When we change ourselves from the inside out, it becomes the skill that we can bring to bear on any challenge that ends up in front of us as a leader. It's really important that we think about how the inner transformation helps us shift from the egoic stance of caring about ourselves. What do I want from this? What is my security, approval, control? What does my ego want to see from this situation? And we shift into the we. What is best for the collective group? If I make this decision and move forward, how will people be affected positively and negatively? All right. We really need leaders to start working on that interior shift so that they can start thinking about the collective. And of course, it's a journey. We're all in different places on the journey. So in terms of teaching, how we're teaching this to people, there are books and programs and classes. And in the last, I would say 5 to 10 years, consciousness has really kind of exploded in terms of, you know, what we're trying to bring to the table to help people be more conscious. One group I want to call out in particular is out of Teachers College, Columbia University. They have a collaborative for spirituality and education, where they're working on bringing spirituality, not to be confused with religious teachings, but spirituality into the K through 12 environment, and really understanding that when executives are talking about conscious leadership, they're talking about waking back up, and that our children inherently have some of these qualities, and yet life, and we socialize it out of them, right? We socialize it out of them. And so if we can keep children connected to source, keep trusting their guts from a much younger age, what might that do for us, 20 and 30 and 40 years out? And so this staying awake versus having to be woken back up at a later date, I think that this is really important. When we're teaching these things to executives, I want to bring up 4 things that I think are probably the most important that you can take from this talk and practice in your own life. One of the most important things that I feel is in the research is this idea of the mindfulness pause. So in between stimulus and response, there's a moment, right? Viktor Frankl says that there is a moment when we still have control over what we're going to do next. We feel so often that something happens and we react. And you're right, that's your unconscious brain. But if you can figure out how to use that pause to stop when something happens and say, just for a second, how do I want to respond versus react to this? Responding versus reacting is really the key. And I can't tell you how many executives have sat in front of me and it really looks like a light bulb goes off, that they feel like, oh, I have a choice. There's a free will and choice in that moment where you can decide who you want to be. The leaders that I've talked to the pause can be one single breath before we make our decision and we move forward. And sometimes, I mean, it's amazing what people do in that moment. I've heard people talking about laughing, finding some humor, breathing, meditating, praying, sometimes sleeping, right? I'm going to go to sleep and I'm not doing anything until tomorrow morning. So that pause is really what lies your power, right? So that's the most important physical thing that you can do to start making conscious choices about how you want to respond in your daily life and really operate from that conscious leadership perspective. The other three things that I would say are most important is really your level of self-awareness. And this comes back to what Joe was saying. Joe, I just love that you bring the somatic body into this, because our brains are amazing, but they're slow. They're really slow. It's our body that tells us. When I'm uncomfortable or I get mad, my brain doesn't tell me. It's my heart. My heart starts to quicken. My breath gets fast. I can feel the blood rising up my neck. That's my first sign that something is wrong or something is not going, the way that I expected it to. So your self-awareness around what is it that you need to perform at your best self? What are these things that set you off? What are your triggers? Understanding yourself. Keegan and Leahy out of Harvard would say that self-awareness is really the entry point to almost all of these development theories. The second thing that I would say is systems thinking. We need to understand that we are all interconnected. We are all interconnected. No longer can we think of ourselves as islands where what we do does not affect other people, right? And if we look at things like the real estate bubble in 2008, it had effects worldwide. And here we are again in a pandemic. We're so interconnected that boom, everyone is affected and we're all having the same conversation at the same time. So the one difficulty that we have with systems thinking is the old idea of, does a fish know it's in water? So we can only see to the edge of the system that we understand. And even though there are systems beyond it, we can only see to the edge of our own system. And so understanding that not only are we a system, but we're a system in a system of systems, right? And everyone is connected. So also with systems thinking that it's not linear, right? We love to think that we do A and B and C and D happens, but that's not really the case. Sometimes we do A and B thinking C is going to happen, but then G happens. And then because we did A and B, 10 years from now, Z happens. And we're not really paying attention to those things. Our brain doesn't like to think that way. And so opening yourself up to the idea that there may be unintended consequences, there may be further benefits down the road, and really trying to look long-term at what we're doing. The final thing that I want to leave you with before I turn this over to our next speaker is really our ability to practice cognitive and logical empathy. I think that if we think about how we think of others, right? So we say empathy, there's actually 5 different kinds of empathy. So there's lots of ways to practice empathy. Most of the time we think of emotional empathy. I feel what you're feeling. But cognitive and logical empathy is where we take the time to stand in another person's shoes. So this research goes back to 1934 with Mead, was one of the first persons who talked about this with role-taking opportunities. That I am developed as a person in terms of my psychological maturity, my emotional maturity, my moral maturity, when I can stand in another person's shoes and see what they see from their perspective. It doesn't mean that we agree. We don't have to agree. But our ability to practice holding those two things at the same time, maybe our viewpoint and others' viewpoints, and then making decisions from there. That also expands our ability to think and to practice conscious leadership. And so, John, I'd like to turn it back over to you. Thank you really for the opportunity. And if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to elaborate.
Thank you so much, Corrie. That's great. I love the mix too. And now we're going to a third ingredient in the soup that we're cooking here. But I love what Joe's brought into it, what you're bringing into it, and what David will be bringing into it. I wasn't doing what you are so good at, is monitoring the chat. So I don't know if there's a question jumping out at that for you, but you can maybe look that over while David's talking and see if there's something that you can address. Our next panelist is David Marshall. As I said earlier, my first meeting of David was when he joined Berrett-Koehler Publishers 15 years ago.
About 12 years ago.
12 years ago. And a little background on me and Berrett-Koehler. I met the founder of Berrett-Koehler when he was in between being the publisher of Josie Bass Publishing and before starting Berrett-Koehler. And his premise, his vision for starting Berrett-Koehler was a world that works for all, which is very much similar to the mission of the Conscious Leadership Guild. So we're very much aligned and delighted that David is a member of our guild. Recently, I'm saying 3 years or so ago, the founder, Stephen Persanti, who was wearing 3 hats, CEO, publisher, or acquisitions editor, and publisher. And he gave away 2 of those roles, one to David and another one to another person that had been a long time member of the Berrett-Koehler staff. And I think they're just hitting stride now. In my view, Berrett-Koehler is probably the most progressive book publisher in the world, in my view. What else can I say about David? He came from a digital background. Would you call yourself a digital native?
No, because Bob Johansson, one of our authors, says digital natives are Generation X or millennials. So
you're too old.
64 years old. I'm a boomer. I don't qualify, but I've been in the digital space. Definitely. I was selling Apple II computers back when they first came out in the late 70s. So I've been around the software business for a long time.
So you're too old. You're too old to qualify. All right. Well, David, we're giving you the role of the organizational leader, and we'd love to hear what you have to say.
Well, thank you so much. I'd like to also express my thanks to Jim Garrison for inviting John Renesch and the Conscious Leadership Guild folks, and to John Yu for inviting me to represent the third leg of the stool, the side, the academic side, and beside the consultant or thought leader side is C-suite. And for me at Berrett-Koehler, just to say a word about the source or synchronicity that Joseph was talking about before. I grew up in Chicago in an intentional community where we were really trying to solve the social and economic woes of the world. That's really what revolutionizing Christianity was all about. It's pretty radical stuff. And one of the songs we would sing is "All the Earth Belongs to All." And then I got into the software business for 30 years and experienced a lot of what I would call cutthroat and or top-down command and control type leadership. Kind of got burned out by all of that and retired at 50. I was going about my own merry business, and someone from my men's group and I was writing books with my wife about how to foster family communication between generations. And I thought, well, that's what I'm going to do for the rest of my life. And someone from my men's group said, I see a job for a digital community builder at a little publishing company in San Francisco called Berrett-Koehler Publishers, and you ought to just apply as a lark. And so I did. I was completely overqualified, but they took me in, and I had never been with any tech company more than 5 years in my whole life. And here I am almost 13 years later, still here. And that to me was just this wonderful sense of source in my life, for synchronicity coming to me, where this experience just dropped in my lap. And this is for me the meaning and purpose of my life that goes right back to the very beginning, and all the wonderful thought leaders I've met over the years. We have about 800, 900 authors. We publish about 60 books per year. We publish in 3 areas. So our overall mission is connecting people and ideas to create a world that works for all. And we're all about positive change. And we produce books or publish books for change makers around the world. And we do it at 3 levels: at individual level, at organizational level, and societal level. So individual level are more personal development books, but more about career and purpose of life. What is my purpose and meaning, and how do I build a career? At the organizational level, a lot of what Corrie was just talking about in terms of what are all the whole systems and ways of completely changing the way we do business. That's our sweet spot, and that's about 50% of our business. And then at the current affairs level is the societal level, and that would be all the ways that we can change the world for the better. So that's the work that we do at Berrett-Koehler. We're a B Corp and we're a benefit corporation, and I feel delighted to have been invited into the Conscious Leadership Guild, because what I find about that group is that I've been in a lot of business-oriented groups before, or business-oriented associations, but what I find unique about the Conscious Leadership Guild is almost to the person. I've only been to several events now, but what I experience is people have had some kind of awakening experience in their life where they were a certain way and they were living the way, kind of society norm says this is the way we live, whether it's the capitalist agenda, the normal capitalist agenda, or other ways of living. And then just something happened where they woke up and said, that's not the person I want to be anymore. I want to be this kind of person. And a big shift to me is moving away from the ego and moving more to the eco, or moving away, as Corrie was saying, from thinking of what is looking at the world from yourself versus what is looking at the world from others. And we have a lot of books on this subject. I want to name one that goes back to the theory you and Otto Scharmer, who worked on this with Peter Senge and Joseph Jaworski in a minute. But before I do that, I want to just lay out for the group where Berrett-Koehler is right now, and where I believe we're at a huge watershed moment or an inflection point in 2020 in our own history. So as John said, we're almost 30 years old now. We started in the early 90s, and we have this mission, an audacious mission, of course, of trying to create a world that works for all. We've probably touched 400 million people out of the 7 billion people in the world, but that's still only 5%. So our penetration rates, we have a long way to go in terms of having the real kind of impact on the world that we're hoping to solve our or to get to our current mission. And we know this is many generations. Nothing will happen in the lifetimes of any of the first or second generation of the folks that are working on this. But when I think of what's happening in 2020 specifically, I kind of think of four areas. One is the pandemic that has hit us all globally has exposed a huge underbelly, especially in the United States, where a large percentage of the folks that are dying are people of color, specifically Black people and Latinx. And poor people, and they're dying at higher rates than their percentages would indicate. And it's really exposing the inequalities of our economic and social system. I mean, we've known about it, of course, but just to see it in such stark terms in terms of who's dying in any one day or week is eye-opening, I think, and unnerving for a lot of us. The second piece is the racial injustice that has been with us in America since the beginning of slavery. It's part of our culture, it's part of our fabric. So many of us, especially I believe the boomers and the liberal crowd, that lived through the civil rights era in the 60s like to think a lot of it is behind us and we're doing a lot better. But, the brazen police killings of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor this year, and the protests on the street, and not just protests of people of color, but you have people in Minneapolis where my daughter is, or Seattle and Portland where I have relatives, where these communities are mostly white people. They don't have as much people of color as a lot of cities, but the young folks are out in the streets in mass protesting. This is not the world that we want to be. That to me is an incredible sign of this is not acceptable, the society we're living in today. So all of that is going on right in the middle of the pandemic. And then you have this unbelievable economic downturn that the pandemic has exposed, with the kind of unemployment rates that we just haven't seen in ages, all the way back to the Great Depression, if it continues. And so many people are, worried about basic things like food, and am I going to be able to keep my rent going, or am I going to, be thrown out on the street? And so you have that level of stress. And in the middle of all of that, in America anyway, we happen to be in, I believe, the most consequential presidential election in at least my lifetime. And I've been through, quite a few elections that were consequential. But when I think of it this time, the visions that are being put before us of, the two major parties, because unfortunately we only have two parties in America versus, a lot more sophisticated way of doing it in Europe and elsewhere where I've lived as well. But in the United States, the visions of the future, one is really asking us to turn inward and to celebrate exclusion. And, I think a lot of people want to do that. But another one is asking us to turn outward toward others and to celebrate inclusion. And boy, if those aren't two radically different leadership paradigms of where we should go. And so Americans and our citizenry, many of whom don't vote and have not voted in past elections, are being called upon to become and show their voices for, maybe the first time in their lifetimes at presidential level, that will help us to decide, well, what is the country that we want to be? Where do we want to go with all this? So all of these four things swirling that I was just talking about are providing unbelievable stress on our systems, on our minds, on our hearts, on our spirits, on our bodies. And Michelle Obama just this week in her podcast said, I have to admit, I have to reveal that this is leading to low-grade depression for me, and that not only am I in a low-grade depression, I believe a lot of people I'm with are in low-grade depression. So when we're all experiencing this collective low-grade depression about, oh my God, how bad is it? And what can I do? What we then think of as Berrett-Koehler is, well, what does that mean for us? What is our responsibility? What is our role? What can we do that we're not already doing? Because we're publishing, a lot of great books on this subject. We specifically have made a big commitment starting back in 2014 to have a lot more books in the diversity, equity, inclusion space, and to be focusing on authors of color, women authors, authors under 40, to have younger voices, as well as international authors. And we have a lot of work in this subject, but it's too easy for us to just rest on our laurels and say, look at all these great DEI books we're publishing, and not say, well, what can we be doing better internally as a company in terms of our own commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion as a company in our own practices, both at staff level and board level. So we're doing a lot of internal searching right now for ourselves, but and we're producing some, what I believe is cutting edge material for the world. We've got a offering coming up. We're not a book publisher in the traditional sense anymore, because about 3 years ago we made a big commitment to online training programs, and we've been doing online training summits as well as online training courses based on the content of our authors. But we've got one coming up this fall and starting next month in September called Leadership for a Changing World. And it is profiling authors such as Otto Scharmer, Ken and Margie Blanchard, Peter Block, who's kind of the father of Berrett-Koehler in a sense with his seminal work on stewardship and the stakeholder-driven model, Margaret Wheatley, as well as quite a number of authors who represent the new voices of Berrett-Koehler, such as Sonia Renee Taylor, Mary Frances Winters, Edgar Villanueva, who are bringing voices that have been underrepresented in the past. So we're really excited about that because they're all talking about what is the new paradigm of leadership? What are the paradigms that don't work anymore? What are the paradigms that do work for the future? And I wanted to close with something that is kind of getting back to what Joseph was saying in the first place. Otto Scharmer, I just interviewed last week for his talk on this upcoming summit. And he's done a lot of work in Theory U, as I was saying before, but one of my favorite Berrett-Koehler books is this one right here. It's called Leading from the Emerging Future, From Ecosystem to Ecosystem Economies. And it's basically taking all the work of Theory U and saying, how do we take that at a whole systems level to take what is true for a person at the individual level and apply it to the societal level, to the whole system. And what he was saying is that it's too easy in times like this to be lamenting about what is wrong, what's not working, is learning from the past, as opposed to envisioning what is the future telling us, what is the future calling out to us to say this is the world that we want. And that's his work on presencing, of course, using Theory U to say, look into the future and say, what is it that you envision, and talk about that, 90% of the time. You can talk about for 10% of the time the things that aren't working, such as the things that I was talking about on these 4 swirls that are going on right now that are making us so depressed, but focus on where you're going, not where you've been. And that's just really powerful for me. And where it's so powerful is it brings it at the societal level that is completely congruent with the individual level, because another big area that I've been really struck with at Berrett-Koehler's work is Ken Blanchard's work. We came out with a book a couple of years ago called Servant Leadership in Action, where he was saying, how can you achieve great relationships and great results? But it was based on the overall servant leadership premise that says, get out of your own ego and put yourself in other shoes, as Corrie Voss was just telling us, and how to think of the world as others do, as opposed to just how you do. The Arbinger Institute with the outward mindset is another area that is in the same area for us, but it's like, how do you get out of your own shoes and be in other shoes? And in doing that as an individual, but then taking that up to a societal level in such a way that we are really getting out of the shoes we're in today and the shoes we want to be in tomorrow at a societal level really helps us from a company. So the last thing I wanted to say is that talking about things just landing in your lap, or when you're in a state of synchronicity, things come to you. I think our work in the online training area in the last 3 years, although it's been very difficult, led to a call to us just a couple of weeks ago by one of our biggest authors, David Cooperrider, who many of you know is kind of the father of, or one of the fathers and mothers of the appreciative inquiry movement, which has been so important in some of our work in organizational development area. And he's now putting together in something that he's been working on for 4 years now already, the Global Forum for Business as an Agent for World Benefit, which was always a in-person event. But with the coronavirus and with everything going on now, the fifth one is going to be completely an online experience. And with all the work we've been doing in online, he said, you know, let's do it together. And he already brought in Paul Pullman, who many of you may know. He's actually a guild member as well, as the former head of Unilever, who himself was saying, you know, business has to be different, you know, going to the business roundtable and saying, business has to be different in the future. We can't continue to be just beholden to our shareholders with the shareholder primacy model. We must be thinking of all stakeholders of the world. And maybe Paul Pullman was influenced by the purchase of Ben & Jerry's and what Ben Cohen and Jerry Greenfield said to him to say, you know, you really have to look at things bigger than you are now. But for whatever reasons, you know, the fact that a Paul Pullman would say, yes, I want to be part of that kind of adventure, and then bring in other like-minded CEOs from big corporations who really want to change. And what I would hope is that, you know, folks like Jamie Dimon of JP Morgan Chase, who is finally awakening himself, he's having an awakening experience. Tim Cook of Apple Computer, having an awakening experience. Satya Nadella of Microsoft, CEO, having an awakening experience. That these kind of very influential business leaders can say, I'm just not going to do it anymore the way I was doing it. We need to do it differently. And so this is so exciting to me, that what is going on right now, and with so much of the tragedy around us in 2020, that we see it as an opportunity without diminishing the pain of it and the depression that it's causing, but to see that there could potentially be phoenixes rising out of these flames, out of these fire and ashes that we're experiencing this year. And in 2021 and beyond, we have an ability to actually be the future that we are envisioning in the way that Otto Scharmer is asking us to consider for the future. So with that, I want to turn it back over to you, John.
Thank you, David. Wow. 3 great perspectives. Thank you so much. I thought while you were talking, David, I thought of a question to ask each of you, the 3 of you. And that is, as a business executive, as a CEO, or as a researching academic, or as a consultant, what is the biggest challenge you face in staying awake yourself? And maybe we could work backwards and start with you, David, since you're kind of warmed up, and then go to Corrie, and then go to Joseph.
Well, back to what Corrie was just saying is, I was just interviewing Mo Edgelali of the Mindful Leader group for our Leadership for a Changing World Summit yesterday, and asking him the very question about, well, what's really different from mindful leadership, from stewardship leadership and servant leadership and all the other great progressive new leadership that are, you know, creating the future. And he said, well, it's really in the practices that we do in terms of meditation, and figuring out a way to bring in meditation, or the pause, to step back, to do reflection, and whether that's through just meditation or yoga or Tai Chi or Qigong or you know, the different kind of things that both Joseph and Corrie were referring to. What I have in my own life is I have a meditative practice, I have a yoga practice, I have a way of doing that, but I get so darn busy with Berrett-Koehler work. Sometimes I'm up till 2 in the morning just trying to get through my emails and doing it. And then I don't do my practices. And I don't have those times of the day to be able to just take the pause and to see the bigger picture of where I'm going. And I know I should be doing it. I know that that's critical, to where I need to be in order to have everything in equilibrium. And so if I do not do my practices over multiple days and weeks, I definitely feel myself going out of equilibrium. And so that's probably one of my biggest challenges, is just to not just be conscious that that is part of my life, but to make sure I'm practicing it every day.
Thank you, David. Corrie.
Yeah, David, I definitely identify with what you're speaking of there. You know, I had a mentor not that long ago say to me, and I think it was Stephen Covey, who came up with this idea of how we organize our day, that we have our big rocks, we have our smaller rocks, and we fill the rest of our time with pebbles. And then he said to me, what if your practices were actually the big rock, the thing, the one thing that if you get done, that everything falls in line behind it? And that was really kind of freeing for me. It was like, okay, if I do my spiritual practice today, I will have time for this work. I will be more effective when I show up. I will be a better parent. I will be a better spouse. I'll be a better daughter. I'll be a better friend. And so that was really freeing for me. And then also I would say kindness and love to myself, because I fall off the horse too. We all do. I was acting unconsciously, or, I just reacted to something and that isn't how I wanted to do. But then we sling the second arrow towards ourselves. I didn't do it the way I wanted to. Right. And then we're beating up on ourselves for that as well. And so when I find myself out of alignment, my latest practice has really just been kindness and love to bring myself back into alignment, and to understand that no matter how conscious you are, you will fall off. There is no enlightened being who never reacts, never gets triggered, never falls out of line. And so to just say, okay, how do I center myself and bring myself back in, and really take those couple breaths and, not sling that second arrow that then just brings you even further out of alignment. So those are my practices. Thanks, John.
Thank you, Corrie. Joseph, back to you. You're muted, Joseph.
Oh, sorry. Got it. Thank you, John. So, I thought what David and Corrie both said were spot on. The short answer is, John, is that's exactly what I focus on. If I have to leave 50 emails unaddressed, the thing that I have learned is for me to make as my supreme concern doing my practices, and then in line with what they were just saying, everything seems to fall in place. Without that, things fall out of balance. So that's a very very major focus for me, and sort of in line with what you were saying. This may not be precisely what you were asking, but I think it's worth mentioning, and that is that business needs to embrace both of the more subtle elements that Corrie and David were mentioning, and I'm just going to call it out. I mean, we can talk about compassion and empathy, and I feel that the most powerful energy in the world is love, and that it is a physical reality that if you cultivate capacity for the art of loving, that has an enormous impact in the world. An enormous impact through the field effect that you and others working with you have. So I just wanted to put a stake in the ground for that.
Thank you, Joseph. Thank you so much. Ironically, there's two things that I would like to share about what's going on in the Guild. One is a group of us that were at the retreat in April that have continued meeting. And what's brought us together was, is there an opportunity represented by this pandemic and the subsequent racism issue that would help bring forth a new paradigm, a different way of being, a world that works for all, etc., a little more easily, since it's been kind of softened up by all this tumultuous and isolation, individual focus, and a lot of expression of love. So that's a conversation that's ongoing in the Guild. And there's another conversation that developed also out of the retreat, which is focused on love. And one of the projects, just not the project, but one of the projects, is we're coming up with a love hour time on Sunday afternoon between 4 and 5, when we want everybody that wants to can tune in and just send love to the world, because the world's in need a lot of love right now. So we are probably a week or two away from being able to release it publicly and all have the URL ready to watch and all that sort of thing. But it just seemed like, even though it was a bit premature, I wanted to get it out there that was going on in the world. And the last thing I wanted to say was, I can't place it right now because I'm not as good as Corrie is on tracing the chat, because there's a lot of stuff in the chat. But I did see a comment about, how come you're not talking about environmental issues and so forth? And I think what we all agree to, the four of us, is that conscious leadership is pretty much the major crisis of the day. You could call it global warming, you could call it genocide, you could call it racism, you could call it a lot of these different tributaries. But they all have in common is a lack of conscious leadership. And that's why we are focusing on that. Not to say we don't care about global warming, we don't care about racism. We're seeing this as a major leverage point, that if we can get more people to act more consciously, more existing leaders to act more consciously, more people that aren't in leadership positions necessarily to take responsibility for what's going on, we can get a lot of regular people to take on things that other people aren't taking on that we think they should be taking on, like stands against fossil fuels and a lot of other things that we all would agree on. With that, I ask each of you if you have questions of any of the others, and I'll kind of step back before we bring Jim back in.
I have a couple questions I'd like to put in from the chat. John, thank you for bringing up Judy Hopkins' questions on the environment. Claire had a question around the indigenous people in Colombia and whether or not we know of any conscious leadership work being done with that community and anything in that region in terms of helping what's going on in that area. Do we know of anything going on there?
I am personally not aware of anything right now. The interesting thing is that we only have 100 members right now, and we have no members from South America. So that's probably one reason we don't know much about that.
The Pachamama Alliance, which is being profiled in a new book that we've just come out with called Touching the Jaguar by John Perkins, that was also the author of Confessions of an Economic Hitman. The Touching the Jaguar is about John Perkins' work with the indigenous people in the Brazil area, and he's done a lot of work in Latin America in general. Earlier, he was in Ecuador, and the Pachamama folks have been very active in Latin America. So it may be that they have done some work specifically in the Colombia area with indigenous people. So I'll take a look at that because I'm curious about that. But the whole big message of Touching the Jaguar that came from the indigenous people of the Amazon is when the jaguar is in front of you in the path, don't run away, because it's a lot faster than you are and it'll hunt you down and kill you. Actually turn toward the jaguar and touch the nose of the jaguar, which is a metaphor for confronting your fear. That when you're fearful, as we all are right now with all these swirls going on, instead of running away from them or curling up in a cocoon, touch it and lean into it, and you can break through to the world that we're envisioning. So, and that came directly from the indigenous people of the Amazon and the work of Pachamama and John Perkins in being with them and taking that wisdom and bringing it out to the world.
You just reminded me,
You
Dave,
know,
Pachamama co-founder Lynn Twist is one of our members, but we could follow up with her on that. Joseph?
yeah, I was just going to follow up on what David was saying and now what you're saying, that Lynn Twist is a good friend, and the story of the founding of the Pachamama Alliance is in the book Source. And it's a marvelous story of Lynn and operating strictly from source, and she and John being in a dialogue one evening in I think it was in Brazil, with a shaman, and the whole story is one of that's an eye opener, but it's a classic study of someone operating from source and then acting, trusting source and then acting on it. I have such respect for her and her husband and John Perkins.
Thanks, Joseph. Corrie, do you have other questions from the chat?
So there was one person asking us to share the diversity statistics from the guild, which I think is important. So John, would you like to share some of that information about this group?
It's the diversity demographics of our membership is not at all what we'd like, and we're very much aware of it. For whatever reason, we have attracted way more men than women. We've attracted few people of color. Most of our core membership at the beginning we're seniors. So we're looking for younger people, and we've established a scholarship program in order to bring younger people in that can't afford to join. Not that it's expensive, but if you're still in graduate school, $200 is still a lot of money. And the other area of diversity that we're looking to improve is have more international members. We have about 20% of our membership are outside the US, but we'd like to see that closer to half or even more. But we did start here in California, so about 40% of our membership is based here, but we're looking to grow globally. So we have work to do in that department, but we're not going for satisfying the politically correct quotas per se. We're still going for quality of people that are really into the conscious leadership mindset or non-mindset, heart set.
I wanted to address a question that had come in. Diane Skidmore said, apologies for arguing, but we're not all fearful. Some of us are loveful. Coronavirus has been a blessing and moved us along in this place. I just wanted to emphasize that too and say an awakening moment for me weekend this year is I went to, at the Haas School of Business at Berkeley, a weekend course that was set up for MBAs and executive MBAs called Interpersonal Skills and Embodied Leadership. And it had a lot of somatics in it, but the general premise was exactly what Corrie was saying before, is there's a stimulus between what happens to to us, or there's a period between what happens to us and the stimulus and the response, and that's where our freedom comes. And all the work was about feelings and being able to say, when something happens, how do I be conscious of it and be mindful of it and name it and name the feeling, and then come back and express it to the person at the feeling level, not at the or at the conscious level, not just at the mindful level. So it's getting out of our minds into our bodies and hearts and being that person. And my experience of it, in going back and talking to all our colleagues and many authors about it, is it's a way to become more loving. It's a way to emphasize relationships as opposed to just performance. And that's one of the big challenges of so many companies, is we're all about ideas and talking about ideas, and we don't go deep enough to really say, what is it to be talking about leaning into each other as people in relationships? And when we're really doing that, when we're practicing embodied leadership, we're really working on the relationships, and you're seeing the love flowing. So now we at Berrett-Koehler, like when Ken Blanchard comes and visits us, you know, he tells us how much he loves us, and we tell him how much we love him as well. And to just be able to even use those expressions in a business sense goes, well, that's not what you're supposed to do in business. But boy, is it powerful, and just in terms of saying, what is it that we are wanting to be together as a community, and to be able to do that together. And my big remark to all the students that were in this class together with me, they were all late 20-somethings, early 30-somethings, except for me. I was the old man in the group. And I said, boy, you know, I went and got my MBA back when I was in my late 20s, but we didn't even have any courses like this back then. They didn't do that. It was all about finance, accounting. It was all about ideas in the head. None of it was really about this really powerful work that leaders need to know. And the fact that these 30 years later, you know, business schools are starting to train on this area of, you know, powerful emotional intelligence and what it means to be really in touch with your body and your heart, and not just your mind, is what leaders of the future need. So I'm completely in agreement that that's where we need to be going, and that's part of our presencing for the future.
Great. Thank you, David. Any other questions? Corrie's done. The chat's done. Joseph, any last remarks before we bring Jim back in?
No, I just want to add a word of appreciation, John, for your two things: for your founding the Guild, for your having that inspiration and acting on it, and then for your fabulous way of releasing it, so that those of us now in the Guild can continue to shape it and form it for a purpose that you know, that's going to work for all of us. And I just deeply respect you for that. So I just wanted to say thank you.
Thank you, my friend. Thank you.
And in that vein, there's a big conversation going on within the Guild about what is the difference in the Guild that's going to make a real difference. I mean, there's one or two other or several other organizations similar to the Guild, but what is the difference that's going to really make the difference to address some of the things that Jim was talking about? And what's emerging in the Guild now is that if the Guild is a force of source, that's the difference that'll make the difference.
Thanks for bringing that up, Joseph. Really appreciate that, because I don't really know of any organizations that are like us, but that might be been a bit of founder ego or something like that, you know. But anyway, the force for source has been a phrase that's been rumbling around since we started a year and a half ago. Excuse me. Jim, you ready to come back in?
Sure. Thank you, everyone. I would just note that there was a couple of really good questions in the Q&A. box, one by Crystal Steinberg, which I think is worth just everyone's comment. That would be okay, John. She was asking the question of art as a practice. There was an emphasis on meditation, but the data, as you all know, shows that the same areas of the brain are activated in creativity, artistic creativity, as in meditation. So I think that's probably worth someone's comment. And then another question, which I think is useful to just reflect on, was around, is there a difference between conscious leadership and what is called mindful leadership? There's a lot of mindfulness practice, mindfulness this and mindfulness that. Is there a distinction that you all would make between mindfulness and consciousness?
So I would like to add my viewpoint to the first question on art. So one of the things that I want to bring in here is the neuroscience behind creativity. So when we are caught in fear or unconscious reaction, we're really in a state of fight or flight. And when we are caught in fear, our body actually responds in very specific ways. This would be Richard Boyatzis's research out of Case Western Reserve, again, talking about how our vision narrows, right? So we can get away from the tiger. Our digestion stops, and it actually turns off the creative part of our brain, okay? So when we take those breaths and we begin to activate the parasympathetic nervous system and activating our creativity, that we're actually pulling ourselves and helping ourselves get into a state of more connection with source, mindfulness. We're turning off that fear response and turning on another part of our brains. So while my art might not be very good, it is something that I practice with my little girl who's 8. And so, I mean, I do think that it's absolutely a way to get in touch with source and to bring that best part of ourselves forward.
Yeah, I would add writing and music as well as art. I used to draw a lot. I almost became an artist as a professional. I think writing has replaced my art that I used to do in the past. But I get that same feeling of elation, creativity, focus when I'm writing. Not necessarily for publication, just writing because I want to be writing something. We also have a member or two in the guild that they are into music pretty heavily for that same reason. Music gives them, it lifts their spirit, it gives them a wider breadth of expression where they don't have that fear, they have that calm and creative space they access.
I'll add to that, well, to the music, is singing. The intentional community that I grew up in the 60s and 70s, we used to have to sing for our breakfast, lunch, and dinner every day. And we had a way of taking popular songs like John Denver's Country Roads and putting new words to it that were more words of, healing the earth. And that's where All the Earth Belongs to All came from, but to the tune of John Denver's Country Roads. And I still sing those today, whether it's in the shower, in the morning, getting ready for this session to bolster myself up. But I find that singing, even if it's just to myself, is an unbelievable way of, bringing out the love.
Jim, on the other question, so I agree with everything everyone has just said. It's absolutely spot on. On the other question about conscious leadership and mindful leadership, my instinct is that, or my view is that mindfulness is and I mentioned this in my remarks earlier, is a really big important practice that leads to conscious leadership. But I believe conscious leadership is a broader and larger framework than just simply mindful leadership. So conscious leadership relates to how we see the world, relates to our worldview. It relates to our relationship to the universe. And there's a principle that I know is true, and that is how we see the world, how we see the universe drives our performance. How we see the universe drives our performance. So a conscious leader sees the universe in the way I was describing earlier. And a conscious leader's practices definitely include mindfulness. So that's the comment I would make on that.
I would agree with you, Joe. And one of the things as an academic, I'm always interested in language, as I'm hearing a lot today, is verses, right? So we're separating things unnecessarily into polarities. It's not mindful leadership versus conscious leadership. It would be mindful leadership and conscious leadership, right? So how do we shift that polarity thinking from, oh, it has to be one or the other, to and, right? Both and. So conscious leadership is mindful and it's authentic presenting, right? It's also, conscious interacting with people, a way of being, a way of living. And so that because we all the time are like, I love you, but no, I love you and it can all be true at the same time. And it's just such a beautiful, tiny little shift in our language that just gives us this freedom and room to breathe instead of having to pick between two unnecessary polarities.
Completely agree. Thank you, Corrie.
Yes, thank you, everyone. And I have deeply appreciated the sensitivity with which all of you have approached this issue of conscious leadership, both in terms of the requirement that anyone wanting to be conscious needs to be mindful and engage in those kinds of practices of whatever kind, artistic or meditative, but a largely creative that brings you into connection with source. And it's worth just noting that they say that the people that are the most connected with source are children at play. And I
love that.
That's just worth noting. The neurophysiology of a child who is playing with abandon is source. And
I couldn't agree more.
We lose that as adults, and we have to kind of discipline ourselves back into the playfulness. But it's worth noting. And I would also just, given the fact, Joe, that you're with us, I just want to remember your father at this time when his conscious leadership as the second special prosecutor during the Watergate era was crucial in bringing Richard Nixon to justice. And I think that's an important point to raise, given the circumstances of the world today, that we've come to a juncture, everyone, where conscious leadership has to make some very tough decisions. We have so abandoned leadership. We have so abandoned consciousness, mindfulness, and given ourselves into to a despoilation of other people and the environment to such an extent that we are now teetering on the precipice, quite literally, of self-destruction. When you take in that 50% of all the species in the world have been cut in half over the last 60 years, you get some measure of the carnage that's happening around the world, and the urgency of a leadership cadre coming from all dimensions of life that can certainly connect with source, certainly play and engage in creativity of all kinds, but in the end has to have courage to be conscious. Because as the situation devolves into more and more apocalyptic indicators, as the major indicators get worse and worse, the courage to be, as Paul Tillich, the theologian, put it in the 1950s and 1960s, is one aspect of conscious leadership that I think is just worth adding, at this moment. It was Carl Bernstein, and this is why, Joe, your dad came to mind, is that Carl Bernstein wrote an op-ed, and I think it was the Washington Post last week, where he says, this is the same moment where the Republican leadership needs to do with Trump what the Republicans finally found the courage to do, in part because of Leon Jaworski back in 1974. And it's our lack of awareness of this, he said, that constitutes the major part of our predicament. So I think it's important for us, given our situation, to accentuate the courage of leadership that seeks to be conscious, the political implications of leadership, given the circumstances of our time. And finally, our capacity to be willing ourselves to be the leaders we have been waiting for. And I think this is a point that's been made by all of you in different ways, but we're coming down to ground zero. It's clear that our governments, nor our corporations, nor our multilateral institutions are rising to the occasion. And that's one reason why we chose the term humanity rising. I think it was you first, John, that talked about leaders just emerging out of humanity. Because one thing that the pandemic has made crystal clear is that there's no more neutral ground. There's none of us that are sort of outside the problem. All of us are under lockdown. All of us are engaging in social distancing. All of us are being affected by a hyper-complex world in which small events everywhere, anywhere, can have major repercussions everywhere. So all of us need to make our choices. And that's been one of the consistent themes, by the way, of Humanity Rising, that the strongest demographic bloc in the world is the consumer. And if the consumers alone would become conscious and exercise conscious leadership in the choices they make every time they go to a supermarket, every time they go to an electronics store or an auto showroom, or whatever choices they make of what they buy, that could be, in the end, the domain of the highest potential for conscious leadership. So I wanted to tease both the Leon Jaworskis of the world, who rose to be not an attorney general, a special prosecutor but also all of us in our day-to-day choices, because the conscious leadership we need to exercise is at all kinds of levels simultaneously in the world right now. So I just want to thank all of you for a splendid, inspiring panel day. It's been very, very important. And tomorrow we're going to be accentuating the note of courage needed for conscious leadership. And we're going to be having Linda Tucker. Many of you know Linda Tucker is the founder of the White Lion Protection Trust in South Africa. She was an unconscious fashion designer. She found herself in a inebriated Land Rover out in the wilds of South Africa, and all of a sudden the Land Rover broke down. They were surrounded by a pride of lions. One of the lions was giving birth. They were angry, and the lions were about ready to attack when a African woman came out of the darkness with a child on her shoulder, walked right up in the pride of lions and calmed them down and rescued Linda and her colleagues. That act of conscious leadership was so powerful that it changed Linda Tucker's life. And in an instant, she understood that she needed to protect the white lions. And tomorrow, on the 8th of August, which is a very potentiated day astrologically for the white lions, we're going to have her with us. And then the next day, as I said before, we're going to be commemorating the 75th anniversary of the bombing of Nagasaki. So if you juxtapose Hiroshima and Nagasaki, you have two qualities that are essential for the human race to take up. One is conscious leadership. And secondly is the courage to exercise it every day with every choice.
Yep.
So thank you, John. Thank you, Corrie. Thank you, David. Thank you, Joe. It's been an honor and a privilege to hear you today. And we'll convene everyone, same time, same station tomorrow, 5 o'clock to 7 o'clock p.m. for Linda Tucker and her commemoration of these days under the theme of the courage of the white lions. We need their courage now. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you tomorrow.
Jim. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jim.
Good to see you, Joe. Very good to see you again.
Thank you.